Imagine you are standing in the highest court of the Catholic Church. It's January in the year 897. The room is suffocatingly silent. Dozens of powerful cardinals are sweating in the winter cold, but no one is looking at the judge. Every single eye in the room is locked on the defendant, because the man sitting on the trial chair, dressed in the most sacred, jewel-encrusted robes of the Vatican, has been dead for 9 months. The Vatican today is a symbol of absolute sanctity. It is quiet. It is holy. It is the spiritual anchor for over 1 billion people. But if you were to stand in the highest court of the Catholic Church in January of the year 897, you wouldn't feel holy. You would feel terrified. The room is suffocatingly silent. Dozens of powerful, wealthy cardinals are sweating in the winter cold. But no one is looking at the judge. Every single eye in the room is locked on the defendant sitting in the center of the floor. He is dressed in the most sacred, jewel-encrusted robes the Vatican has to offer. But he isn't moving, because the man sitting on the trial chair has been dead for 9 months. This isn't a myth. This isn't dark fantasy. This actually happened. The man rotting in the chair was Pope Formosus, and the man pacing the floor, screaming accusations at his decaying body, was the newly crowned Pope, Stephen VI. To modern ears, this sounds like pure madness, the ravings of a lunatic who dug up a corpse out of blind vengeance. But it wasn't. History usually gets this wrong. What you are about to witness wasn't madness at all. It was a masterclass in the darkest, most terrifying political chess game in human history. And it all started with a fatal calculation. To understand how a dead body ends up on trial, we have to throw out everything we know about the modern papacy. In the late 9th century, being the Pope wasn't just a religious job. It was the ultimate geopolitical prize. The mighty Carolingian Empire, the empire built by Charlemagne, was collapsing. Italy had become a lawless war zone, violently torn apart by rival dukes, warlords, and aristocratic mafia families. And whoever controlled the Pope controlled the wealth and the armies of Rome. Enter Pope Formosus. Formosus wasn't just a priest, he was a brilliant, ruthless strategist. He knew that the local Italian warlords, specifically a brutal family known as the Duchy of Spoleto, were getting too powerful. They were breathing down his neck, demanding control over the Vatican. So Formosus did what any desperate king would do. He called in a bigger, scarier army. He allied with King Arnulf of the Franks and invited a foreign military to march into Italy to crush the Spoletans. And it worked. The Spoletans were driven back. But Formosus made a massive mistake. He assumed he would live long enough to keep them at bay. In April of 896, Pope Formosus died of natural causes. The brilliant strategist was placed in a marble tomb, and the world moved on. But the Spoletan family did not. They had sworn revenge, and with Formosus out of the way, they quietly crept back into Rome. They intimidated the cardinals, bribed the guards, and successfully placed their own puppet on the papal throne, Pope Stephen VI. Stephen VI was a loyal attack dog for the Spoletan faction. He hated Formosus. But Stephen didn't just want to erase his predecessor's legacy. He needed to legally annihilate him. And this is where the story shifts from a normal political rivalry into absolute, chilling genius. Stephen VI had a massive problem. A problem that could cost him his life. Under the strict laws of the church at the time, a man who was already a bishop of one city could not be transferred to another city to become pope. It was highly illegal. But Stephen was a bishop before he took the throne. Meaning legally, Stephen's papacy was fraudulent. He was an impostor. If his enemies realized this, he wouldn't just be stripped of his crown. He would likely be executed. And here is the twist. Do you know who made Stephen a bishop in the first place? Pope Formosus. Stephen realized that his entire claim to power was a ticking time bomb. But if he could somehow prove that Formosus was never a legitimate pope to begin with, then every single decision Formosus ever made would be erased. If Formosus was a fake, then Stephen's appointment as bishop was a fake. And if Stephen was never legally a bishop, his path to the papacy was suddenly completely legal. It was the ultimate legal loophole. But Stephen had to prove it. He had to officially, publicly declare Formosus guilty of perjury and illegally seizing the papacy. But how do you convict a man who has been dead for 9 months? Stephen realized there was only one way to make it legally binding. He couldn't just sign a piece of paper. He had to put him on trial. In January 897, Stephen ordered the marble tomb of Formosus shattered open. When the heavy stone lid was pushed aside, the smell of the crypt flooded the halls. The body had been rotting in the damp Roman earth for nearly a year. But Stephen didn't care. He ordered the guards to drag the stiff, decaying body through the streets of Rome, all the way to the Basilica of St. John Lateran. They forced the stiff limbs into the sacred, gold-threaded vestments of the Papacy. They placed a crown upon his skull, and they strapped him to a wooden chair in the center of the courtroom. But a trial needs a defense. A defendant has to be able to speak, so Stephen appointed a deacon, an 18-year-old kid, to stand behind the corpse and answer for it. Can you imagine the sheer psychological terror of this teenager? He is forced to stand in a freezing room, overwhelmed by the stench of death. He has to speak for a decaying skull, physically grabbing the dead man's head to make it nod, while the most powerful man in the Western world paces the floor, veins bulging, screaming accusations at them both. Why did you usurp the universal Roman see in such a spirit of ambition? Stephen screamed at the corpse. The terrified 18-year-old boy, trembling behind the chair, was forced to squeak out a reply. Because I was evil. It was a grotesque piece of theatre. The cardinals in the room were paralyzed by fear. If they spoke out against this, they knew they would be next. The outcome was decided before the first word was ever spoken. Pope Formosus was found guilty. The punishment was absolute. Stephen ordered the papal robes ripped off the rotting body, replacing them with the filthy rags of a peasant. Then, they took a blade and severed the 3 fingers on his right hand, the exact 3 digits Formosus used to bestow blessings. They were physically stripping away his connection to God. They dragged the mutilated corpse through the dirt streets of Rome, while the crowds watched in stunned silence, and hurled him into the freezing, violent currents of the Tiber River. Stephen thought the river would wash away his problem forever. He had won. His papacy was secure. He was wrong. Revenge is a pendulum, and Stephen had just pulled it back as far as it could go. The people of Rome were deeply superstitious. They didn't see a brilliant legal maneuver. They saw a horrific blasphemy. And when a freak earthquake shook the city just days later, collapsing part of the very basilica where the trial was held, the public took it as a sign of divine wrath. Within months, the city erupted. A violent mob breached the palace gates. They seized Stephen VI. They stripped him of the very robes he had desecrated, dragged him into a lightless, underground dungeon, and strangled him to death in the dark. History is rarely poetic, but in this case, the river provided its own verdict. A few days after Stephen's death, a monk walking along the banks of the Tiber River found something washed up in the mud. It was the body of Formosus. He was quietly rescued, cleaned, and eventually given a proper, honorable burial inside St. Peter's Basilica, where he rests to this day. You would think that the strangulation of Stephen VI would have ended the madness. But the Cadaver Synod broke something fundamental in Rome. It proved to every warlord, duke, and assassin in Italy that the throne of St. Peter wasn't a holy sanctuary. It was just another crown to be won with swords and shattered tombs. The Cadaver Synod kicked off a period so violently unstable that historians actually refer to the era that followed as the Saculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the Papacy. Over the next 12 years, Rome would go through 7 different popes. Most of them were assassinated. Some of them dug up the trial records just to declare Formosus guilty all over again. We like to think of history as a steady march forward. But stories like the Cadaver Synod remind us that the line between holy law and absolute, bloodthirsty madness is incredibly thin. All it takes is one desperate man looking for a loophole. If you want to dive deeper into the Saculum Obscurum and the chaotic warlords who turned the medieval Vatican into a mafia state, let me know in the comments below. Hit the like button if you learned something new today, subscribe so you never miss an upload, and as always, thanks for watching.